The thunder clapped as Byrne ran, her white wedding dress in tatters, mud splashing up her legs with each desperate step through the Colorado wilderness. She had made her choice, better to face the savage wilderness than marry a man who saw her only as a transaction, a breeding mare for his dynasty. Behind her, the voices grew fainter, her father's enraged shouts dissolving into the storm that had providentially arrived just as she fled the church in Greeley. The year was 1878, and Rebecca had just committed social suicide. At 22, she was considered nearly a spinster already, and her father had arranged a marriage to Harold Whitcomb, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory. The fact that Harold was 30 years her senior and had buried 2 wives already meant nothing to her father, who saw only the security and status the union would bring. Rain pelted Rebecca's face, washing away tears she refused to acknowledge. Her carefully styled auburn hair hung in soaked tendrils around her face, pins lost somewhere along her desperate flight. The expensive satin shoes her father had imported from back east were ruined, the heels breaking off within the first mile of her escape. "I will not go back," she whispered fiercely to herself, pushing deeper into the thickening forest as lightning illuminated her path in stark, terrifying flashes. "I would rather die free than live caged." The woods grew denser as she climbed higher into the foothills. Rebecca had no plan beyond escape, no provisions, no knowledge of survival. The daughter of a banker, she had been raised to pour tea and play the piano, not to navigate wilderness. But determination fueled her steps even as exhaustion began to claim her body. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came a bone-deep cold that seeped through her sodden wedding dress. Rebecca's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she huddled beneath a large pine, its branches providing minimal shelter from the relentless rain. She knew the dangers of exposure, had heard stories of travelers found frozen in these very mountains, but fear of returning pushed her onward until her legs simply would not carry her anymore. Sleep came in fitful bursts, nightmares of Harold's cold eyes and her father's rage jolting her awake. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but Rebecca's situation had only worsened. Fever burned through her body, her lips cracked from thirst, and the vastness of the wilderness stretched before her in every direction, indifferent to her plight. "Water," she croaked, staggering to her feet. The sound of her own voice startled her. It seemed alien, already weakened by just one night in the wild. "I need to find water." Rebecca stumbled down a slope, hoping that water would flow downhill, praying that someone might find her before the wilderness claimed her life. It was a cruel irony that she had escaped one death only to face another, equally certain but far more painful end. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes' time lost meaning as Rebecca's fever climbed higher. The trees began to spin, and shadows danced at the edges of her vision. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats, she was convinced it was another hallucination, a cruel trick of her fading mind. But the hoofbeats grew louder, more insistent, and then a shadow fell across her face. Rebecca tried to focus on the figure silhouetted against the bright sky, a man on horseback, but darkness claimed her before she could utter a single word. Caleb Harrison had seen many strange sights in his years riding the Colorado wilderness, but a woman in a torn wedding dress, unconscious in the middle of nowhere, was definitely a first. He dismounted quickly, kneeling beside the prone figure. Her skin burned with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. Miss, can you hear me?" He touched her shoulder gently, receiving no response. Caleb looked around, searching for any sign of others, but they were alone in the vast wilderness, at least 2 days' ride from Greeley or any other settlement. Caleb was no stranger to making difficult decisions. At 32, he'd spent more than half his life on his own, working as a trapper, hunter, and occasionally as a guide for those wealthy Easterners who fancied themselves adventurers. He lived by a simple code: mind his own business and let others do the same. But he couldn't leave this woman to die. No matter what circumstances had brought her here, with careful movements, he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her limp form against his chest. His cabin was a half-day's ride away, tucked into a hidden valley where he retreated between jobs. It wasn't much, but it had a roof, a fireplace, and the medical supplies she desperately needed. "Hold on, miss," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. Just hold on." The journey back to his cabin seemed interminable. The woman's fever worsened, and several times Caleb feared she would die in his arms before they reached shelter. His horse, Shadow, sensed the urgency and maintained a steady pace even as the terrain grew challenging. By late afternoon, the small cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of pines with a small stream running nearby. Caleb had built it himself 7 years ago, a sanctuary from the world that had never been particularly kind to him. He rarely brought anyone here, preferring to meet clients and traders in town, but this was an emergency that overruled his usual caution. Inside, he laid the woman gently on his bed, quickly starting a fire in the stone hearth. The cabin was sparse but clean, containing only the necessities. A table, 2 chairs, shelves stocked with provisions, and the narrow bed where she now lay shivering despite her fever. Caleb worked efficiently, drawing water from the stream and heating it on the fire. The wedding dress was filthy and soaked through, a problem he approached with clinical detachment. He had a spare shirt and pants that would be enormous on her frame but dry and clean. With as much propriety as the situation allowed, he removed the ruined dress, averting his eyes as he wrapped her in a blanket before changing her into his spare clothes. Her wedding dress, he noted with a trapper's eye for detail, had been expensive, the kind of finery only the very wealthy could afford. The fact that she'd run from such a marriage raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. Caleb bathed her face with cool water, coaxing small sips of water between her parched lips. He added herbs to the water, remedies learned from an old Ute medicine woman who had once saved his life after a bear attack. Throughout the night, he maintained his vigil, rewetting cloths as they warmed against her skin, speaking softly when nightmares made her thrash and cry out. Dawn was breaking when her fever finally broke. Caleb, exhausted from the sleepless night, had dozed off in the chair beside the bed when a soft voice startled him awake. "Where am I?" The woman was watching him through clear green eyes, confusion and wariness evident in her expression. "Who are you?" "Name's Caleb Harrison," he replied, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "Found you about half a day's ride from here in pretty bad shape. This is my cabin, you're safe." "Rebecca," she offered after a moment's hesitation. "Rebecca Byrne, Miss Byrne." He nodded, standing to pour her a cup of fresh water. "You've been running from something or someone." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway, her voice stronger than he expected. "My wedding. I was running from my wedding." Caleb handed her the cup, careful not to touch her fingers with his own. "Must have been some groom to make you flee into the wilderness with no supplies, no horse, and no plan." A flash of defiance lit her eyes. "Some would say any groom is preferable to certain death in the wild." "Some would be wrong," Caleb replied simply. "The wilderness gives you a fighting chance at least. Some marriages don't even offer that." Rebecca studied him over the rim of her cup. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. His dark brown hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord, and a scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his short beard. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the men she'd known in Greeley society, but there was something compelling about his face, a quiet strength that spoke of hardship endured. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saving my life." Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rebecca said with certainty born of bitter experience. "They wouldn't have." The next few days established a cautious routine. Rebecca's strength returned slowly, and Caleb maintained a respectful distance, sleeping on a bedroll near the fire while she took his bed. He hunted and trapped, bringing fresh meat that he taught her to prepare. Rebecca, for her part, took over the cooking and cleaning of the small cabin, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple, necessary tasks. On the 4th day, when Rebecca was strong enough to sit outside on the small porch, Caleb finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Your people will be looking for you." Rebecca's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending, one of his, torn during a hunting expedition. "Yes. Want to tell me why you ran?" She was silent for so long that Caleb thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant, as though recounting someone else's story. My father arranged my marriage to Harold Whitcomb. He owns half the cattle in the territory and most of the businesses in Greeley. He's also 47 years old and has buried 2 wives already." Caleb's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped his knife, paused in the act of skinning a rabbit. "My father's bank was failing," Rebecca continued, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "The marriage was the price of Harold's investment. I tried to accept it, tried to be the dutiful daughter, but when I stood at that altar and saw his eyes..." She shuddered. They were so cold, so possessive, like I was just another piece of property he'd acquired. I knew in that moment I would rather die than be his wife. "So you ran," Caleb said softly, "right into a storm." "I wasn't thinking clearly," she admitted. "I just needed to get away. I had some wild notion of reaching Denver, finding work as a teacher perhaps." Caleb resumed his work on the rabbit, his movements precise and efficient. "Whitcomb's not the type to let what he considers his property simply disappear. He'll have men searching." Fear flickered across Rebecca's face. "Will you turn me in? If they come asking," the question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Caleb set down his knife, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time since he'd found her. "No, Miss Byrne, I won't. Rebecca," she corrected softly. "Please call me Rebecca." A week passed, then 2. Rebecca's strength returned fully, and with it came a growing awareness of her precarious situation. She couldn't stay in Caleb's cabin indefinitely, yet she had nowhere else to go. Harold Whitcomb's influence extended throughout Colorado territory. If she attempted to reach Denver or any other settlement, word would eventually reach him. For his part, Caleb found himself increasingly drawn to the woman who had invaded his solitude. Rebecca wasn't like any woman he'd known, and he'd known few enough, living as he did. She was educated, refined, but there was a core of steel in her that had allowed her to flee into the unknown rather than submit to a life she couldn't bear. She learned quickly, watching him set traps and clean game, asking intelligent questions about the wilderness that surrounded them. In the evenings, she read aloud from the few books he owned, her voice bringing to life stories he'd read in solitude a dozen times before. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside the cabin windows, that the fragile peace they'd established shattered. Rebecca was reading from a battered copy of Ivanhoe when the distant sound of horses brought them both to alert stillness. "Stay here," Caleb instructed, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, there's a trapdoor beneath the rug. Hide in the root cellar until they're gone." Rebecca nodded, her face pale but composed as Caleb slipped out into the darkness. The riders were still at a distance, moving slowly through the snow. 3 men, Caleb noted, leading a 4th horse, a pack horse laden with supplies. He recognized the lead rider immediately, Thomas Fletcher, a tracker known for finding people who didn't want to be found. The other 2 were strangers, but the rifles they carried and their wary postures told Caleb all he needed to know. These were Whitcomb's men. Caleb had a choice to make, and he made it without hesitation. Circling wide around the approaching riders, he positioned himself on a ledge above their path, rifle ready. When they drew close enough, he called out, "That's far enough, Fletcher." The men reined in sharply, hands moving to their weapons before they spotted Caleb on the ridge above them. "Harrison," Fletcher squinted up at him. "That you? It is, and you're trespassing?" Caleb kept his voice level, conversational almost, but his rifle remained trained on the group. "No offense meant," Fletcher said carefully. "We're looking for someone, a woman gone missing from Greeley. Banker's daughter ran off on her wedding day." "Haven't seen any banker's daughters out here," Caleb replied, which was technically true when he'd found Rebecca. He hadn't known who she was. "What's Whitcomb paying for her return?" Fletcher named a sum that would have set Caleb up comfortably for years. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the life such money could provide, a proper ranch perhaps, cattle of his own, no more scraping by on what he could hunt or trap. Then he thought of Rebecca's face when she spoke of Whitcomb, the terror and revulsion that no amount of money could justify inflicting on another human being. "Not interested," Caleb said finally, "and I suggest you turn back. Storm's coming in, and this pass gets dangerous when the snow's heavy." Fletcher studied him for a long moment. "You sure about that, Harrison? Whitcomb's not a man to cross." "Neither am I," Caleb replied evenly, "and this is my territory. Turn back, Fletcher." A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft whicker of nervous horses and the increasing whisper of snowfall. Finally, Fletcher nodded. "Your call, Harrison, but if you change your mind, the offer stands for a week. After that, Whitcomb's doubling it, but not for a living return. He's decided if he can't have her, no one will." The implicit threat hung in the air as Fletcher signaled his men to turn around. Caleb remained on the ridge until they disappeared from sight, then circled back to the cabin through a route that would leave no tracks for them to follow. Rebecca was exactly where he'd left her, the book still open in her lap, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the pages. She looked up when he entered, her eyes asking the question she was afraid to voice. "Whitcomb's men," Caleb confirmed, setting his rifle aside and moving to stoke the fire. "They're gone for now, but they'll be back. Fletcher's the best tracker in the territory." "You sent them away," Rebecca said softly. "Why?" Caleb's hand stilled on the fire poker. "You know why." "They offered you money." "They did." "How much?" Caleb named the figure, watching her face pale at the sum. "It wasn't enough," he added simply. Rebecca closed the book carefully, setting it aside as she rose to her feet. "No amount would be, would it?" It wasn't really a question. "No," Caleb agreed, and something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had dared name. Rebecca crossed the small room to stand before him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, smell the faint lavender scent of her hair from the dried sprigs she'd found in his supplies. "We can't stay here," she said quietly. "They'll come back with more men." "I know." Caleb resisted the urge to touch her, to brush away the strand of auburn hair that had fallen across her cheek. "I've been thinking on that. There's a place further west, over the mountains. A friend of mine has a trading post near a settlement that's just starting up. Whitcomb's reach doesn't extend there, not yet." "How far?" 2 weeks by horse if the weather holds, longer if it doesn't." Rebecca nodded slowly, considering. "When do we leave?" "First light," Caleb replied, surprised by her ready acceptance of the plan. "We'll need to travel light fast." "It won't be easy." A smile touched Rebecca's lips, transforming her face in a way that made Caleb's heart stutter. "Nothing worth having ever is, Mr. Harrison." They worked through the night, preparing for the journey. Caleb showed Rebecca how to pack only the essentials, how to distribute weight evenly on the horses. He had 2 Shadow, his reliable gelding, and a younger mare named Star that he used as a pack horse. Rebecca would ride Star, with Shadow carrying their supplies. By dawn, the cabin was stripped of anything useful, the remaining provisions hidden in the root cellar in case they needed to return. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine white blanket across the landscape, beautiful but treacherous. It would make tracking them easier, but Caleb knew routes through the mountains that few others dared to travel. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Caleb helped Rebecca mount Star. She wore layers of his clothing beneath a heavy coat, her hair tucked up under a fur hat, her hands protected by leather gloves lined with rabbit fur. She looked nothing like the refined banker's daughter who had fled her wedding. This woman was prepared to face the wilderness on its own terms. "Ready?" he asked, swinging up onto Shadow after securing their packs. Rebecca nodded, her breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. "Ready." They rode in silence as the sun rose, Caleb leading them through paths invisible to the untrained eye, always angling west and south, away from Greeley and deeper into the mountains. By midday, they had climbed high enough that Rebecca could look back and see the valley where the cabin stood, a tiny dot in the vast wilderness. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing at the panorama of snow-covered peaks and valleys. "I never knew Colorado could be like this." "Most people don't," Caleb replied, allowing himself a moment to appreciate the view alongside her. "They stick to towns, roads, they never see the real heart of this land." "Is that why you live out here? For this?" Rebecca gestured to the sweeping vista. Caleb considered the question, one no one had ever asked him before. "Partly. It's honest out here. The mountains don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. A storm will kill you just as quick whether you're rich or poor, good or bad. There's a kind of fairness in that. And in town. Among people, that's different," he said, an edge creeping into his voice. "People have expectations, judgments. Out here, I'm just a man trying to survive. In town, I'm the son of a hanged thief, a half-wild trapper not fit for polite company." He hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about Rebecca drew truths from him he usually kept buried. To his surprise, her expression showed no disgust or pity, only a quiet understanding. "My mother killed herself when I was 14, she said softly. Laudanum overdose. Everyone in Greeley knew, but no one ever spoke of it directly. Just whispers behind fans, meaningful glances. Poor Rebecca, tainted by her mother's weakness. That's why my father was so desperate for the match with Whitcomb to erase that stain with wealth and position." Caleb studied her face, seeing the old pain there but also the strength that had allowed her to survive it. "Seems we both know something about carrying others' judgments." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, then straightened in her saddle, looking forward rather than back. "But not anymore, not out here." The journey west proved every bit as challenging as Caleb had warned. They traveled from dawn until dusk, making camp in whatever shelter they could find: caves, dense stands of trees, once even an abandoned trapper's hut similar to Caleb's own cabin. The weather alternated between clear, bitter cold and blinding snowstorms that forced them to hunker down for days at a time, rationing their provisions carefully. During one such storm, trapped in a small cave barely large enough for themselves and the horses, Rebecca woke in the night to find Caleb sitting at the cave's entrance, rifle across his knees, staring out at the swirling snow. The small fire cast his profile in sharp relief, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the alertness of his posture despite days of exhausting travel. "You should sleep," she said softly, sitting up from her bedroll. "I can keep watch." Caleb glanced over at her, surprise evident on his face. "I'm fine, go back to sleep." "You haven't slept properly in days," Rebecca insisted, moving to sit beside him. Their shoulders almost touched, and she was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body in the cold cave. "You can't keep going like this." "Have to," he replied simply. "Fletcher will have figured out we've gone west by now if I let my guard down even for a night." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Rebecca studied his face in the flickering firelight. The weeks of travel had changed them both. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, now bore calluses and small scars from setting up camp and handling horses. Her skin had darkened from exposure to the sun, and her body had grown leaner, stronger. But the changes in Caleb were more subtle, a softening of the wariness in his eyes when he looked at her, a tendency to stand closer than strictly necessary when they stopped to rest. "We're in this together," she said finally. "You don't have to carry it all alone." Caleb turned to her then, really looking at her for the first time since they'd made camp. Something in his expression made her breath catch, a naked vulnerability she'd never seen in him before. "I've been alone a long time, Rebecca. It's what I know." "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His answer was to reach out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away and brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather light, but it sent warmth coursing through her body that had nothing to do with the fire. "Now I'm not sure of anything," he admitted, "except that I need to get you somewhere safe." "I am safe," Rebecca said with quiet certainty. "With you." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibilities neither was ready to name. Finally, Caleb dropped his hand, but the ghost of his touch lingered on her skin. "Get some sleep, Rebecca," he said gently. "I'll wake you at dawn." The next morning broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight. They made good time, pushing the horses as much as they dared through the deep snow. By midday, they had crested a pass that Caleb said marked the halfway point of their journey. "See that valley?" He pointed to a distant depression between two towering peaks. "That's where we're headed. My friend's trading post is just beyond it. 2 more days if we're lucky." Rebecca shaded her eyes against the brilliant sunlight reflecting off the snow. "It's still so far." "Closer than we were," Caleb replied with a rare smile, one that transformed his face and made her heart skip a beat. "And no sign of pursuit. We might actually make it." The optimism was short-lived. As they began their descent into the valley, Shadow suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Caleb immediately tensed, one hand going to his rifle. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered, recognizing the signs of danger from their weeks of travel together. "Not sure," Caleb murmured, scanning the seemingly empty landscape. "But Shadow senses something." Could be a mountain lion, could be the crack of a rifle shot cut him off. the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from his head. Caleb reacted instantly, wheeling Shadow around and grabbing Star's reins, pulling both horses behind the shelter of a large boulder. Down. He shouted, and Rebecca needed no further prompting, sliding from Star's back and pressing herself against the cold stone. "Fletcher?" she asked, voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Caleb nodded grimly, checking his rifle. "And whoever he brought with him." "They must have cut around through Sawyer's past its longer but lower. Damn it, I should have anticipated that." "What do we do?" "They have the high ground," Caleb said, assessing their limited options. "And there's only one way down from this ridge that the horses can manage. So we're trapped." "For now." Caleb peered carefully around the boulder, drawing another shot that chipped stone dangerously close to his face. "I count 3 rifles spread out along the ridgeline. Fletcher's smart, positioning them to cover the whole descent." Rebecca's mind raced, considering and discarding ideas. "Can we wait them out? They must be low on supplies too." "They've got that pack horse I saw them with before. They could hold this position for days." Caleb's expression was grim, "And the temperature's dropping. We can't stay here overnight, not exposed like this." Another shot rang out, followed by Fletcher's voice calling across the distance. "Harrison, we know you've got the girl. Send her out and we'll let you ride away. Whitcomb just wants what's his." "I'm not his," Rebecca hissed, anger momentarily overriding fear. "I never was." "I know," Caleb said quietly, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And you never will be. We're getting out of here, both of us." How? Caleb studied the terrain, the positions of Fletcher's men, the gathering clouds that suggested another storm approaching. "There's a route straight down the face of this ridge. It's not meant for horses, barely meant for men, but it's our only chance." "The horses, we'll have to leave them," Caleb said, regret evident in his voice. He loved those animals Rebecca knew had raised them from colts. "Take what we can carry and go on foot. They'll follow our tracks in the snow, not if the storm hits first." Caleb glanced at the darkening sky, "And not if they think they don't need to." Understanding dawned on Rebecca's face. "You have a plan." "A desperate one," Caleb admitted. "I'm going to create a diversion, make them think we're trying to break through their line. While they're focused on that, you slip down the cliff face. There's a trail of sorts, marked by red stones I placed years ago. Follow it to the bottom and wait for me in the stand of pines to the west." "And if you don't come?" Rebecca couldn't keep the fear from her voice. Caleb touched her cheek briefly, the gesture more intimate than any words. "I'll come, but if I don't, keep heading west. My friend's name is Samuel Brooks. Tell him I sent you." Before Rebecca could protest further, Caleb was stripping gear from the horses, packing only the barest essentials into 2 small bundles. He handed her the lighter one, along with his spare pistol. "You remember how to use this." Rebecca nodded, thinking of the lessons he'd given her during their journey. "Point, steady, squeeze, don't pull." "Good." He checked his rifle one more time, then gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "When you hear me start firing, count to 30, then go. Don't look back, don't stop. Just follow the red stones." "Caleb," Rebecca began, suddenly desperate to say all the things they'd left unspoken during their weeks together, but he shook his head. "Later," he promised, his eyes conveying what words couldn't. "We'll have time later." Then he was gone, moving with the silent grace of a man who had spent his life in the wilderness. Rebecca counted her breaths, trying to calm her racing heart, the pistol heavy in her hand. The sound of Caleb's rifle shattered the stillness, followed immediately by return fire from Fletcher's men. Rebecca counted to 30 as instructed, then slipped from behind the boulder, staying low as she made her way to the cliff edge Caleb had indicated. The drop made her stomach lurch, a near vertical descent of at least 200 feet. But true to Caleb's word, she could see the faint trail marked by reddish stones, a precarious path that zigzagged down the face of the cliff. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca secured the pack on her back and began her descent, the sounds of gunfire above driving her forward despite her fear. The climb was harrowing. Twice she nearly lost her footing on ice-slick rocks, and once a handhold crumbled beneath her fingers, leaving her dangling by one hand over a terrifying drop. But Rebecca persevered, thinking of Caleb risking his life above, of the freedom waiting if they could just reach the valley below. By the time she reached the bottom, her hands were raw and bleeding despite the gloves, her body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The gunfire had stopped some time ago, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. Rebecca made her way to the stand of trees Caleb had indicated, concealing herself as best she could while watching the cliff face for any sign of his descent. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The storm Caleb had predicted rolled in, snow beginning to fall in thick, blinding sheets. Rebecca huddled deeper into her coat, fighting panic as time passed with no sign of the man who had risked everything to save her. "Come on, Caleb," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind. "Please." Just as despair began to overtake hope, a shadow moved at the base of the cliff. Rebecca raised the pistol, then lowered it immediately as she recognized Caleb's familiar form, moving slowly, one hand pressed to his side. She ran to him without thought for caution, reaching him just as his legs seemed to give way. He leaned heavily on her, his breath coming in pained gasps. "You're hurt," Rebecca said, seeing the dark stain spreading across his coat. "Caught one in the side," Caleb confirmed, his voice strained. "Not too deep, but I'm losing blood. Fletcher's dead. The others ran when the storm hit." "We need shelter," Rebecca said, taking charge as she slipped her shoulder under his arm. "Can you walk a little further?" Caleb nodded grimly, and together they staggered through the increasing snowfall, following a small stream that Caleb insisted would lead them to a suitable campsite. After what seemed like miles but was likely only a few hundred yards, they found it a shallow cave formed by an overhanging rock, sheltered from the wind and large enough to accommodate them both. Rebecca helped Caleb inside, then quickly gathered what dry wood she could find before the snow made it impossible. Soon a small fire burned at the cave's entrance, providing minimal warmth and light as she tended to Caleb's wound. The bullet had grazed his side, tearing a furrow through flesh but missing anything vital. Still, he'd lost blood, and infection was a constant danger in the wilderness. Rebecca cleaned the wound with melted snow and the precious little whiskey Caleb had packed, then bound it with strips torn from her spare shirt. "How bad?" Caleb asked through gritted teeth as she worked. "You'll live," Rebecca replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "If infection doesn't set in." "Good," he murmured, his eyes already closing with exhaustion. "Too much to say to die now." Rebecca smiled despite the dire circumstances, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Rest, I'll keep watch." The storm raged through the night, wind howling past their small shelter, snow piling up at the entrance until Rebecca had to clear it periodically to prevent them from being buried alive. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words she couldn't catch, sometimes staring at her with a clarity that suggested important things on the verge of being said. By dawn, his fever had spiked, his skin burning beneath her touch. Rebecca used snow to cool his brow, coaxed water between his cracked lips, and prayed as she had never prayed before. Not to the distant God of Sunday services, but to whatever forces had brought them together, whatever chance had led Caleb to find her that day in the wilderness. "Don't you dare leave me now," she whispered fiercely, holding his hand between both of hers. "Not after everything. Do you hear me, Caleb Harrison? I forbid it." Whether it was her words or simply his own remarkable constitution, Caleb's fever broke as the storm cleared on the second day. Rebecca wept with relief when he opened his eyes, clear and focused for the first time in hours. "You stayed," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Of course I stayed," Rebecca replied, wiping away tears. "Where else would I go?" Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing with surprising strength. "Most would have continued west, saved themselves. I'm not most people." Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. "And I wouldn't leave you, not ever." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully examine. But something had shifted, a barrier broken during those long hours of uncertainty. Caleb tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer until she lay beside him, her head resting carefully on his uninjured shoulder. "When I saw Fletcher's men take aim at you," he said quietly, "I knew something I should have recognized weeks ago." "What's that?" Rebecca asked, her heart beating so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "That a life without you in it isn't one I'm interested in living anymore." Rebecca raised herself on one elbow to look into his face, searching for any sign of fever-induced delirium. Finding none, only a vulnerable honesty she'd glimpsed before but never so openly displayed, she smiled. "Good," she said simply, "because I've come to the same conclusion about you." It took 3 more days before Caleb was strong enough to travel. Days spent in the intimate confines of the small cave, learning each other in ways that went beyond the physical. Rebecca told him of her childhood in Greeley, of a mother who had retreated into laudanum-induced dreams rather than face the reality of her loveless marriage, of a father who saw his daughter only as an asset to be traded for advantage. Caleb shared his own story, a father hanged for a theft he maintained he didn't commit, a mother who had retreated to her family back east, leaving 10-year-old Caleb to fend for himself in a world that showed little kindness to the son of a convicted criminal. "How did you survive?" Rebecca asked as they shared the last of their jerky, watching the sun set on their final evening in the cave. "Found work where I could, stables mostly at first, then as a scout for the army when I was 16. Learned tracking, hunting, how to live off the land." Caleb shrugged as if the hardships he'd endured were inconsequential. "Eventually saved enough to build my cabin by shadow, been living that way ever since." "Alone," Rebecca said softly, understanding now his initial reluctance to help her to become involved in her problems. "Alone was safer," he agreed, then smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that made her heart stutter. Until it wasn't. The next morning, they set out on foot, following the valley floor westward. The snow had melted enough to make travel possible, though still challenging. Caleb moved slower than usual, his wound healing but still painful, and they covered less ground than hoped. "How much farther to your friend's trading post?" Rebecca asked as they made camp on the 4th night after leaving the cave. "Another day, maybe 2, Caleb replied, wincing slightly as he settled beside the fire. "Depends on how fast we can move." Rebecca studied him with concern. "Your side is bothering you more today." "It's fine," he insisted, though the tightness around his eyes belied his words. "Just tired." Rebecca moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The casual contact would have been scandalous in Greeley society, but out here, after all they'd endured together, it felt natural, necessary even. "What will we do when we reach the trading post?" she asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind as their destination grew nearer. Caleb was silent for a moment, staring into the flames. "Samuel will give us shelter, help us get established. The settlement nearby is growing, they'll need skilled people." "And what skills do I have?" Rebecca's tone was light, but the question was serious. "I can play the piano, pour tea, and recite poetry in French, hardly useful frontier accomplishments." "You've learned more than you realize these past weeks," Caleb countered. "You can shoot straight, set a snare, build a fire in the snow. Most importantly, you don't give up, even when things seem impossible." He turned to face her fully. "But if you want to go further west, to California or Oregon, I wouldn't blame you. Cities there, opportunities for a woman with your education." The unspoken question hung between them. Would she choose to continue on alone or stay with him? Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I've had enough of cities," she said firmly. "And enough of being what others expect me to be. I want to build something for myself, with you if you'll have me." Caleb's expression softened, vulnerability and hope warring in his eyes. "Rebecca, I have nothing to offer you. No name, no fortune, just yourself," she interrupted, taking his hand in hers. "That's all I want. All I've ever truly wanted was the freedom to choose for myself." "And I choose you, Caleb Harrison." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as years of loneliness and weeks of unspoken longing found expression. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Have since I found you in that storm, I think, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself." "I love you too," Rebecca replied, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural, as inevitable as the sun rising over the mountains. They reached Samuel Brooks's trading post 2 days later, emerging from the wilderness to find a sturdy log building nestled in a small valley, smoke rising from its chimney in a welcoming plume. Beside it stood several smaller cabins and a corral containing horses and a few milk cows. Samuel himself was outside chopping wood when they approached, a barrel-chested man with a gray streaked beard and eyes that missed nothing. He lowered his axe as they drew near, recognition and then astonishment crossing his weathered face. "Harrison," he called, squinting as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "That really you? "It's me, Sam," Caleb confirmed, his arm around Rebecca's waist as much for support as affection. "We could use some help if you're offering." Samuel's gaze took in their condition, the healing wound visible where Caleb's coat hung open, their worn clothing, the exhaustion evident in their faces, and he nodded briskly. "Come in, both of you. Martha," he called toward the trading post, "put on more coffee and heat up that stew. We've got company." Inside, the trading post was warm and surprisingly comfortable, the front room serving as a store while the back contained the Brooks family's living quarters. Martha Brooks, a plump, cheerful woman with kind eyes, took one look at Rebecca and immediately bustled her off to bathe and change into clean clothes, clucking over her condition like a mother hen. "Skin and bones, the both of you," she scolded good-naturedly as she served them bowls of venison stew and thick slices of freshly baked bread. "What on earth happened, Caleb, and who is this lovely young lady?" Over the meal, Caleb related their story, edited slightly for brevity but honest in all the important details. Samuel listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or frowning while Martha made sympathetic noises and pressed more food on them. "Whitcomb," Samuel said when Caleb finished, shaking his head, "man's got a reputation even out here, not a good one either." "Will he come after us?" Rebecca asked, the fear she'd managed to suppress during their journey resurfacing now that they were among people again. Samuel exchanged a glance with Caleb. "Might, he's not a man who likes losing from what I hear, but this settlement's growing and we look after our own. If you two are planning to stay, that is." "We are," Caleb confirmed, his hand finding Rebecca's beneath the table. "If you know of any land available nearby, I've got some savings." "As it happens," Samuel said with a smile, "the parcel adjoining mine to the south is unclaimed. Good water, decent timber, enough flat land for a small farm or ranch. Been saving it for someone who'd make a good neighbor." "That's generous, Sam," Caleb said cautiously, "but I can pay fair price." "And you will," Samuel assured him, "but having you two nearby would be worth more than money to Martha and me. Gets lonely out here in the winter months." Later that evening, with Rebecca resting comfortably in the Brooks' spare room, Caleb and Samuel sat by the fire, glasses of whiskey in hand. "You love her," Samuel observed, not a question but a statement of fact. "More than I thought possible," Caleb admitted, "and she loves you." "Anyone with eyes can see it." Samuel swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You planning to make it official?" Caleb stared into the fire, considering. "She only just escaped one marriage. Wouldn't be right to press her into another so soon." Samuel chuckled softly. "Son, that girl didn't flee a marriage. She fled a prison sentence. What you're offering is something else entirely." He leaned forward, expression serious. "Life out here is uncertain, Caleb. If you love her, don't waste time." The next morning, Caleb and Samuel rode out to survey the available land, returning by midday with plans already forming for a cabin to be raised before the first snow of winter. Rebecca, meanwhile, had found her own place in the small settlement, her education proving unexpectedly valuable when the community learned she could read and write. "They want me to start a school," she told Caleb excitedly as they walked the perimeter of what would soon be their homestead. "Just a small one in the meeting house for now. There are 7 children in the settlement and more in the outlying farms." "A teacher," Caleb said with a smile, watching her face animate with enthusiasm. "It suits you." "Does it?" Rebecca looked uncertain for a moment. "I've never taught before, not formally. You taught me to see beauty in poetry," he replied, stopping to face her. "You'll do fine." They stood on a small rise overlooking the valley, the trading post visible in the distance, the mountains rising majestically behind them. The land spread before them was rugged but beautiful, a blank canvas on which they could create the life they chose. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said suddenly, reaching for her hands. "And I want you to answer honestly, not what you think I want to hear." Rebecca nodded, a hint of wariness in her eyes. "Of course. I love you," he began, the words still new enough to bring a flush to his cheeks. "I want to build a life with you here on this land, but I need to know if that's truly what you want. There's a stage that comes through the settlement once a month. You could be in Denver by next week, San Francisco by the end of the month. You could have a different life, one with more comfort, more." Rebecca silenced him with a kiss, fierce and certain. "Caleb Harrison," she said when they parted, "if you're trying to get rid of me, you'll have to try harder than that." Never, he assured her, relief evident in his voice. I just needed to be sure you weren't staying out of obligation or lack of options. I'm staying because I love you, Rebecca said simply. Because when I'm with you, I'm the person I want to be, not the person others expect me to be. Because the thought of waking up tomorrow without you beside me is unbearable. Caleb took a deep breath, then knelt before her, still holding her hands in his. Then marry me, not because you need protection or because it's proper, but because we choose each other freely and completely. Tears filled Rebecca's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. They were wed 2 weeks later in the small meeting house that would soon serve as Rebecca's schoolroom. The entire settlement turned out for the occasion, along with a few traders passing through and a circuit preacher who arrived providentially the day before. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress Martha Brooks had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Caleb, clean-shaven for the occasion, wore the only suit in the settlement, borrowed from Samuel and a bit too short in the sleeves and legs. Neither noticed these imperfections. As they spoke their vows, eyes locked on one another. The journey that had brought them together seemed less like chance and more like destiny. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared, and the small building erupted in cheers as Caleb kissed his bride, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music provided by a fiddler from a neighboring homestead and enough food to feed twice their number. Rebecca danced until her feet ached, first with Caleb and then with seemingly every man in the settlement, while her new husband watched with pride and a hint of possessiveness that made her smile each time their eyes met across the room. As the festivities wound down, Samuel approached the newlyweds with a wrapped package. Wedding gift, he explained gruffly, handing it to Caleb, from Martha and me. Inside was the deed to the land they'd chosen, marked paid in full, along with a small leather pouch containing seeds for their first garden. Sam, this is too much, Caleb protested, but Samuel waved him off. Consider it an investment in good neighbors, he said with a wink. Besides, your cabin's nearly finished. Be ashamed not to have the land to go with it. The cabin Samuel referred to had been the community's project for the past 2 weeks, everyone pitching in to ensure the newlyweds would have a home of their own. It was small but solidly built, with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. It was to this cabin that Caleb carried Rebecca that night, crossing the threshold with her in his arms as tradition demanded, both of them laughing as he nearly cracked her head on the doorframe. Welcome home, Mrs. Harrison, he said, setting her gently on her feet inside the cabin that smelled of fresh cut pine and new beginnings. Home, Rebecca repeated, looking around at the simple furnishings: a bed in one corner with a colorful quilt made by the settlement's women, a table and 2 chairs, shelves waiting to be filled with the life they would build together. It's perfect. Their life together began in earnest the next day. While Rebecca started her small school, Caleb worked the land, preparing it for spring planting and building corrals for the livestock they hoped to acquire. The winter passed in a blur of hard work and joy, their small cabin a haven of warmth and love against the Colorado cold. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Seeds were planted, calves were born, and the settlement continued to grow as more families arrived, drawn by rumors of fertile land and a welcoming community. Rebecca's school expanded to 12 children, necessitating a proper schoolhouse, which the men of the settlement raised in a single day while the women prepared a feast to celebrate. Through it all, Rebecca and Caleb grew together, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome, each small victory celebrated. They argued, sometimes Rebecca's stubborn independence clashing with Caleb's protective instincts, his solitary habits occasionally frustrating her more social nature, but they always found their way back to each other, stronger for the honest exchange of feelings. As their first anniversary approached, Rebecca had news to share. She waited until they were alone, sitting on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink. I have something to tell you, she said, taking Caleb's hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Caleb's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby," he repeated, as if the word were entirely new to him. "We're having a baby," Rebecca nodded, laughing at his stunned expression. "In the winter, Dr. Miller says, January probably." Caleb gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, searching her face. "Terrified," Rebecca admitted honestly. "But yes, so very happy. Are you?" "More than I can say," Caleb assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this, a home, a wife, a child on the way, never thought I deserved it." "You deserve every happiness," Rebecca said fiercely, cradling his face in her hands, "and so much more than I can give you." "You've given me everything," Caleb said simply. "Everything that matters." The months that followed were busy ones. Their homestead flourished, with a good first harvest and the addition of more livestock, chickens for eggs, 2 milk cows, and the beginnings of a small horse breeding operation using a stallion Caleb had traded for and mares purchased from passing traders. Rebecca continued teaching until her condition made the daily walk to the settlement too tiring, at which point Martha Brooks took over the school temporarily. The community embraced the news of the coming baby with enthusiasm, showering the expectant parents with handmade gifts and practical advice, some welcome and some rather alarming. As Rebecca's time grew near, a letter arrived that cast a shadow over their happiness. It came by way of a trader who had passed through Greeley, addressed to Rebecca in her father's unmistakable handwriting. She read it with Caleb at her side, her hand unconsciously protective over her swollen belly. "My father is ill," she said finally, folding the letter carefully. "Consumption, the doctor says. He wants to see me before he dies." Caleb's expression was carefully neutral. "Do you want to go?" Rebecca considered the question, truly considered it rather than giving the immediate refusal that rose to her lips. "I don't know," she admitted. "He was not a good father in many ways, but he is still my father." "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," Caleb promised, drawing her close. "If you want to go, we'll go together." In the end, the decision was made for them. Winter came early that year, snowfall blocking the mountain passes before they could make arrangements for the journey. A second letter arrived in late December, carried by a half-frozen male rider who had pushed through despite the weather. Rebecca's father had died, leaving his affairs in the hands of his attorney and his daughter as his sole heir. "I should feel something more," Rebecca said that night, sitting before the fire as Caleb rubbed her aching back. "Grief or anger or something. But I feel only a distant sadness for what might have been." "That's grief too," Caleb said wisely, "for the relationship you never had." Rebecca nodded, leaning back against him, finding comfort in his steady presence. "The attorney says there's some money once the bank's debts are settled." "Not much, but enough to add that second floor to the cabin we've been talking about." "Room for the little one to grow," Caleb agreed, his hand moving to rest on her belly where their child kicked vigorously. "And maybe brothers and sisters to follow." Rebecca turned to face him, smiling at the hopeful expression she found there. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A house full of children, a real family." Their son was born on a clear January night, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world with unmistakable Harrison determination. They named him Samuel, after the friend who had helped make their life possible, with Michael as a middle name in honor of Caleb's father. "He has your eyes," Rebecca said as they gazed at their newborn son, wrapped snugly in a blanket made by Martha Brooks. "And I think he'll have your stubborn chin." "Poor child," Caleb joked, though his eyes shone with tears as he counted tiny fingers and toes for the dozenth time. "Let's hope he gets your brains and good sense to balance it out." The years that followed were full in a way neither Rebecca nor Caleb could have imagined when they first met in the wilderness. Their homestead prospered, growing from a single cabin to a comfortable home without buildings, gardens, and pastures where horses grazed. The settlement became a proper town, with a general store, a church, and eventually a railroad station that connected them to the wider world. Samuel was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and then by twins, James and Margaret, 3 years after that. Rebecca resumed teaching when the youngest were old enough for school themselves. While Caleb's reputation as a horse breeder spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as California. They faced challenges, of course drought years when crops failed, a fire that destroyed one of the barns and nearly spread to the house, a scarlet fever outbreak that had them fearing for Elizabeth's life before she finally turned the corner toward recovery. But they faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. Harold Whitcomb remained a distant shadow for many years, rumors occasionally reaching them of his continued search for the woman who had humiliated him. But as Colorado achieved statehood and the territory became more settled, even his influence waned. When news came of his death in 1890, Rebecca felt only a brief shiver of remembered fear, quickly dispelled by the warm reality of the life she had built. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb surprised Rebecca with a trip to Denver, leaving their now teenage children in the capable hands of Samuel and Martha Brooks. The city had grown since Rebecca had last seen it, modern conveniences and fashionable shops replacing the rough frontier town she remembered. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked as they strolled arm in arm down a bustling street, Rebecca wearing a new dress purchased that morning from a shop that would have been unimaginable in the Denver of her youth. "Choosing the wilderness over civilization, choosing me." Rebecca stopped, turning to face the man whose face showed the years of sun and wind and laughter they had shared, whose blue eyes still looked at her with the same wonder they had on their wedding day. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "I ran from a cage into freedom that day, though I didn't know it then, and every step since has been exactly where I was meant to go." Caleb smiled, the expression still transforming his face in a way that made her heart skip a beat even after 20 years. "I love you, Rebecca Harrison. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you, Caleb Harrison," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him right there on the public street, scandalizing a passing matron but caring not at all. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left." They returned home to find their children thriving, their land prospering, and plans already forming for the next generation. Samuel, now 19 and the image of his father, was courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Elizabeth had dreams of attending the new women's college in Denver. The twins, at 14, were already showing their own distinct personalities, James fascinated by the new technologies transforming the West. Margaret determined to become a doctor, despite the obstacles facing women in medicine. As Rebecca and Caleb sat on the porch of the home they had built together, watching the sunset paint the same mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their first declaration of love, their wedding vows, Rebecca thought of the frightened young woman who had fled into the wilderness rather than accept a life not of her choosing. "I was so afraid that day," she said softly, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder. "Afraid of dying in the wilderness, afraid of being forced back to a life I couldn't bear. I never imagined where that path would lead." "To me," Caleb said simply, his arm around her waist, holding her close as they had held each other through joy and grief, triumph and challenge for 20 years and more. "And I to you, just as we were always meant to be." As the stars emerged above the Colorado mountains, Rebecca Byrne Harrison, once a frightened runaway bride and now the beloved matriarch of a thriving family, knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice that long ago day. In fleeing what she feared, she had found what she loved, a life of her own choosing, with a man who saw her not as property but as a partner, not as a possession but as the other half of his soul. And in the wilderness that had once seemed so terrifying, she had found not death but life in its fullest measure, a life built on love, choice, and the freedom to become exactly who she was meant to be.